"You won't leave this bed until I'm yours," said the beautiful stranger he discovered in his mountain shelter. The Winchester rifle felt heavier than usual in Thaddeus Kane's weathered hands as he pushed through the dense pine forest, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp Montana air. 3 days of tracking the wounded grizzly had led him deeper into the Absaroka Mountains than he'd ventured in years. The beast had mauled 2 cattle from the Henderson Ranch, and the $50 bounty meant the difference between keeping his cabin through winter or losing everything to the bank come spring. Snow began falling in thick, wet flakes as afternoon shadows stretched long between the towering evergreens. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning, and Thaddeus knew these mountains well enough to recognize the warning signs of a brutal storm approaching. His leather boots crunched through the accumulating powder as he quickened his pace toward the emergency shelter he'd built 5 years ago, nestled in a rocky outcropping 2 miles from the main trail. The one-room cabin came into view through the swirling snow, its rough-hewn log walls and stone chimney looking exactly as he'd left them last autumn. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, which struck him as odd since he always kept dry kindling stocked inside. Perhaps the wind had blown some down the flue, or maybe moisture had gotten to the wood during the particularly harsh spring thaw. Thaddeus approached cautiously, his years as a cavalry scout during the Indian Wars having taught him never to assume anything in hostile territory. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the mountain wind. Fresh boot prints marked the snow near the entrance, but they were already being covered by the continuing snowfall. Someone had been here recently, perhaps within the last hour. He pressed his back against the rough exterior wall beside the door, Winchester ready, and listened intently. The storm muffled most sounds, but he could detect something unusual from within the cabin. A soft rustling, like fabric moving against wood, and what might have been labored breathing. The door opened silently on its well-oiled hinges as Thaddeus stepped inside, rifle raised and ready to fire. What he discovered made him freeze completely, his finger hovering over the trigger as his mind struggled to process the impossible scene before him. A young woman lay sprawled across his narrow bunk, her raven-black hair fanned across the rough woolen blanket like spilled ink. Her dress, once probably a fine blue calico, was torn in several places and stained with what looked like dried blood. Her olive skin had an unhealthy pallor, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that suggested serious injury or illness. But none of that explained why she was here, 40 miles from the nearest settlement, in a shelter known only to him. Thaddeus lowered his rifle slightly, his tactical instincts warring with an unexpected surge of concern for this mysterious stranger. She appeared unconscious, her full lips slightly parted as she breathed. Even in her current state, her beauty was undeniable. High cheekbones, a delicate nose, and dark lashes that rested against pale cheeks gave her an almost ethereal quality that seemed completely out of place in this rough mountain hideaway. He set the Winchester against the wall and moved closer, his spurs jingling softly against the plank flooring. The cabin's interior remained exactly as he'd left it. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with his cooking implements hanging from iron hooks nearby. A simple wooden table and single chair occupied the center of the room, while shelves lined the opposite wall, holding preserved food, ammunition, and basic medical supplies. The woman stirred as his shadow fell across her, and Thaddeus found himself looking into the most remarkable pair of green eyes he'd ever encountered. They held an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul, despite her weakened condition. She attempted to sit up, wincing with obvious pain, and he instinctively reached out to steady her. Her skin felt feverish beneath his calloused palm. "Easy there, miss. You're hurt pretty bad." Her gaze never left his face as she struggled to focus on his words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't quite place, perhaps Spanish or Italian. "Water," she whispered, her lips barely moving. Thaddeus retrieved his canteen and helped her drink, supporting her shoulders as she took small sips. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his wife Sarah died of consumption 3 years ago. "What happened to you? How did you find this place?" She finished drinking and leaned back against the cabin wall, her breathing still labored but somewhat improved. For a long moment, she simply studied his face with those penetrating green eyes, as if memorizing every detail. "My name is Esperanza Morales," she said finally. "I was traveling with a wagon train from Santa Fe to Helena when we were attacked by bandits 2 days ago. They killed everyone else and left me for dead." The story sounded plausible enough, given the recent increase in outlaw activity throughout the territory. But something about her manner, the way she watched his reaction so carefully, suggested there might be more to her tale. "How did you make it up here? This shelter isn't marked on any map." Esperanza's eyes flickered with something that might have been calculation before she answered. "I followed a game trail through the forest. When the storm started, I saw smoke from your chimney and came looking for help." Thaddeus frowned. He was certain no smoke had been rising when he arrived, but perhaps his memory was playing tricks on him. The stress of the hunt and the approaching weather could have clouded his observations. He began building a fire, using the seasoned pine logs from his carefully maintained woodpile. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's interior and providing much-needed warmth. Esperanza watched his every movement with an intensity that made him oddly self-conscious. As the fire grew stronger, he could see her injuries more clearly. Dark bruises marked her throat and wrists, suggesting she'd been roughly handled. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing smooth skin marred by scratches that looked like fingernail marks. The evidence supported her story of a violent encounter with outlaws. "You need medical attention. There's a doctor in Bozeman, but that's a 3-day ride in good weather. This storm looks like it's settling in for a while." Esperanza shook her head slowly, her dark hair catching the firelight. "I can't leave. Not yet." Something in her tone made him turn to face her fully. She was sitting up straighter now, the color gradually returning to her cheeks as the warmth from the fire reached her. Despite her injuries and torn clothing, she possessed a dignity and strength that commanded attention. "Why not? If you're hurt as bad as you appear to be—" "Because," she interrupted, her green eyes locking onto his with startling intensity, "you saved my life. In my culture, that creates a debt that must be properly repaid." Thaddeus felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the growing fire. There was something in her gaze, a combination of gratitude and something else entirely, that made his pulse quicken in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The storm outside intensified, wind howling through the pine trees and rattling the cabin's single window. Snow piled against the door, effectively sealing them inside together. Under normal circumstances, being trapped with an injured stranger would present nothing but problems. But as Esperanza's eyes continued to hold his, Thaddeus found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about normal circumstances. She reached up slowly, her fingers trailing along the torn fabric of her dress where it exposed her shoulder. The gesture appeared innocent enough, but something about the way she watched his reaction suggested a deeper intention. "I have nowhere else to go," she said softly. "No family, no money, no friends in this territory. Everything I owned was in that wagon train." The implications of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. If her story was true, she was completely dependent on his help for survival. The nearest town lay 3 days away through treacherous mountain passes, and winter was approaching fast. Even if a storm cleared, traveling would be extremely dangerous for someone in her condition. "You can stay until you're healed up," he heard himself saying. "I've got enough supplies to last through winter if necessary." Esperanza smiled for the first time since he discovered her, and the transformation was breathtaking. Her whole face seemed to glow with warmth and gratitude, making her appear even more beautiful than before. "Thank you, Thaddeus Kane." He started at hearing his name, realizing he'd never introduced himself. "How do you Your name is carved into the mantelpiece above the fireplace, she explained, gesturing toward the rough wooden beam, along with another name, Sarah Kane. His jaw tightened as painful memories threatened to surface. Sarah had helped him build this shelter during their brief, happy marriage. She'd insisted on carving both their names as a symbol of their partnership in creating something permanent together. My wife. She died 3 years ago. Esperanza's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. She must have been very special to inspire such devotion. The simple acknowledgement of his grief, spoken without false platitudes or uncomfortable attempts at comfort, touched something deep inside him. Most people either avoided mentioning Sarah entirely or offered meaningless reassurances that time would heal all wounds. As evening deepened outside, Thaddeus prepared a simple meal from his preserved supplies. Salt pork, beans, and hardtack made a poor feast, but Esperanza accepted the plain food with genuine appreciation. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the finest delicacy. Tell me about yourself, she said as they shared the modest dinner. Have you always lived in these mountains? He found himself talking more freely than he had in months, describing his years as a cavalry scout, his marriage to Sarah, and his current life as a bounty hunter and trapper. Esperanza listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that drew out details he rarely shared with anyone. It sounds lonely, she observed when he finished. A man gets used to solitude, does he? Or does he simply convince himself that wanting companionship is a weakness? Her insight struck closer to the truth than he cared to admit. Since Sarah's death, he deliberately isolated himself from human contact, telling himself that self-reliance was strength. But sitting across from Esperanza in the flickering firelight, he felt a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with food. As the night wore on, the storm continued its relentless assault on the cabin. Wind whistled through small gaps in the chinkling between logs, and snow piled steadily against the single window. They were truly trapped together, with no possibility of outside contact until the weather cleared. Esperanza began showing signs of exhaustion, her eyelids growing heavy as the warmth and food took effect. Thaddeus prepared to move his bedroll to the floor, giving her the more comfortable bunk, but she caught his arm as he started to rise. Don't, she said quietly. Please stay close. I've been alone and afraid for so long. The vulnerability in her voice was unmistakable, and he felt his resolve weakening. Everything about this situation violated his carefully constructed emotional defenses, yet he found himself unable to resist her simple request for comfort. He settled back into the chair beside the bunk, close enough to reach her if she needed anything during the night. Esperanza smiled gratefully and closed her eyes, but her hand remained resting lightly on his arm, maintaining the physical connection between them. As she drifted toward sleep, Thaddeus studied her face in the dying firelight. Even with her injuries and the hardships she'd clearly endured, she possessed a beauty that seemed to emanate from within. But more than that, she radiated a strength and intelligence that intrigued him far more than mere physical attraction could explain. Something about her story nagged at the edges of his consciousness, small inconsistencies that his scout-trained mind couldn't quite dismiss. How had she found this remote shelter so easily? Why did she seem so comfortable in his presence, showing none of the wariness he'd expect from a woman who'd recently survived a brutal attack? But as her breathing deepened into the rhythm of natural sleep and her hand remained trustingly on his arm, those doubts seemed less important than the unexpected warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't completely alone. The storm raged on outside, but within the small cabin, something else was beginning to stir. Something that had been dormant since Sarah's death, now awakening in response to the mysterious woman who'd appeared so suddenly in his carefully ordered world. Thaddeus Kane had no way of knowing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine, or that the beautiful stranger sleeping peacefully beside him carried secrets that would challenge everything he believed about trust, love, and the very nature of reality itself. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the cabin's interior, while outside the Montana wilderness held its breath in anticipation of the revelations that daybreak would surely bring. Dawn arrived gray and muted, filtered through heavy clouds that promised more snow before the day ended. Thaddeus woke to find Esperanza already awake, those remarkable green eyes watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. She'd somehow managed to braid her long black hair during the night, and the severe style only emphasized the elegant bone structure of her face. "Good morning," she said softly, and he noticed her voice sounded stronger than it had the previous evening. He stretched the kinks from his neck, grateful that exhaustion had allowed him to sleep despite the uncomfortable position in the wooden chair. The cabin felt warmer than it should have, given that the fire had burned down to glowing embers hours ago. "How are you feeling?" Esperanza sat up slowly, testing her range of motion. The pallor had almost completely left her cheeks, and her breathing appeared normal and unlabored. "Much better, thanks to your care. I heal quickly." Something about that statement struck him as odd, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered him about it. Perhaps it was simply the matter-of-fact way she said it, as if rapid healing were perfectly normal rather than remarkable. He rekindled the fire and prepared coffee from his dwindling supply, the rich aroma filling the small space. Esperanza accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around the warm metal and inhaling deeply. "This is good coffee. Where did you get beans this far from civilization?" "Trading post in Helena. I stock up twice a year when I take my furs to market." She nodded thoughtfully, as if filing away this information for future reference. Again, that slight sense of calculation in her manner that made him wonder what she was really thinking. Outside, the storm had diminished to occasional gusts of wind and intermittent snow flurries. The worst had passed, but several feet of fresh powder would make traveling treacherous for days to come. They remained effectively isolated, thrown together by circumstances neither had anticipated. "Tell me about the bandits who attacked your wagon train," Thaddeus said as they shared a breakfast of bacon and beans. "Did you recognize any of them? Know which direction they headed?" Esperanza's cup paused halfway to her lips, and for just an instant he saw something flicker across her features. Fear? Uncertainty? The expression vanished so quickly he might have imagined it. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. They wore bandanas over their faces, so I couldn't see their features clearly. They spoke English with no particular accent that I noticed. She set down her cup and met his gaze directly. They took everything of value and burned the wagons before riding north toward the Canadian border. The details sounded reasonable, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this explanation. Thaddeus had interrogated enough suspects during his cavalry days to recognize when someone was carefully controlling their words. What about the other passengers? Were there families? Children? A shadow crossed Esperanza's face, and when she answered, her voice carried genuine emotion for the first time since beginning her account. A family from Missouri. Parents and 3 young children traveling to start a farm near Missoula. An elderly minister heading to a new parish. 2 prospectors returning from unsuccessful claims in California. She paused, her hands tightening around the coffee cup. Good people who didn't deserve such a fate. The pain in her voice seemed authentic, whatever else might be false about her story. Thaddeus found himself wanting to comfort her, to ease the obvious burden of survivor's guilt she carried. It wasn't your fault. Sometimes evil finds good people, and there's nothing anyone can do to prevent it. Esperanza looked up at him with those penetrating green eyes, and he saw tears threatening to spill over. Is that what you told yourself when your wife died? That sometimes tragedy strikes and there's nothing we can do? The question hit him like a physical blow, stirring emotions he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. His jaw clenched as familiar anger and grief warred within his chest. Sarah's death was different. She got sick. That's not the same as being murdered by outlaws. Isn't it? Both represent loss beyond our control. Both leave the survivors questioning why they were spared when others weren't. Her insight was uncomfortably accurate, cutting through his emotional defenses with surgical precision. How could a young woman he just met understand his psychological struggles so clearly? You seem to know a lot about grief for someone so young. Esperanza's smile held a sadness that made her appear older than her 20 years. Loss ages a person quickly. I learned that lesson earlier than most. Something in her tone suggested she spoke from personal experience rather than philosophical observation. What tragedies had shaped her understanding of pain and survival? As the morning progressed, Thaddeus found himself increasingly drawn to this mysterious woman who'd appeared so suddenly in his life. She moved with a grace that seemed almost feline, every gesture controlled and purposeful. When she helped him organize his supplies, her hands revealed calluses that spoke of hard physical work, contradicting her refined speech and mannerisms. "You mentioned having no family," he said as they worked side by side. "Where are your people from originally?" "My father's family came from Spain generations ago. My mother was Apache." That explained her striking features, the combination of European and Native American heritage that created such exotic beauty. But it also raised new questions about her background and how she'd ended up alone on the frontier. Apache don't usually travel in wagon trains with white settlers. Esperanza's hands stilled in their work, and he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "My mother left her people when she married my father. She chose his world over her own." There was bitterness in her voice now. She died regretting that choice. The conversation was clearly causing her pain, so Thaddeus changed the subject to more practical matters. They needed to assess their food supplies and plan for the possibility of being snowed in for several weeks. The early storm suggested a harsh winter ahead, and his normal preparations had been interrupted by the grizzly hunt. Working together, they took inventory of his preserved goods, ammunition, and other essentials. Esperanza proved surprisingly knowledgeable about wilderness survival, suggesting modifications to his usual storage methods and identifying plants visible through the window that could supplement their diet if necessary. "You seem to know a lot about living in the mountains," he observed. "My mother taught me before she died. Apache women know how to survive anywhere." Her expertise was certainly convenient, given their circumstances. Almost too convenient, a cynical voice whispered in the back of his mind. But as he watched her competently organizing supplies and planning for contingencies, he found it hard to maintain suspicious thoughts about someone so clearly dedicated to their mutual survival. By afternoon, the snow had stopped completely, and pale sunlight filtered through the overcast sky. Esperanza spent long periods standing by the window, gazing out at the white-draped forest with an intensity that suggested she was looking for something specific. "What are you watching for?" he asked finally. She turned from the window with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just admiring the beauty of fresh snow. I've never seen mountains like these before." Another small inconsistency. If she'd been traveling from Santa Fe to Helena, she would have crossed several mountain ranges at least as impressive as these. But perhaps grief and trauma had affected her memory of the journey. As evening approached, they fell into an easy domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural despite their short acquaintance. Esperanza proved to be an excellent cook, transforming his basic supplies into meals far more flavorful than anything he'd managed alone. She moved around the small cabin with increasing confidence, as if she belonged there. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked as they shared dinner. "My mother, again." She said a woman who couldn't feed her family properly wasn't worth much as a wife. The comment stirred something protective within him, an urge to defend her against harsh judgments from a parent who was no longer alive to explain her reasoning. "You're worth a great deal more than your cooking abilities." Esperanza met his gaze across the small table, and he saw surprise in her green eyes, as if kind words were unexpected rather than routine. "Thank you for saying that." It's been a long time since anyone valued me for more than what I could provide." The sadness in her voice made him want to know more about her past, about what experiences had taught her to expect so little appreciation from others. But something warned him not to push too hard for details she might not be ready to share. As night fell, they sat before the fire, sharing stories and gradually learning more about each other. Thaddeus found himself talking about Sarah again, but this time the memories brought warmth rather than pain. Esperanza listened without judgment, asking questions that showed genuine interest in understanding the woman who'd meant so much to him. "She sounds wonderful," Esperanza said when he finished describing Sarah's laugh. "I hope someday I'll find a love like that. You're young. There's plenty of time. Is there? Sometimes I feel like I've already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences." Again, that sense of hidden depths, of secrets she couldn't or wouldn't share. What had happened in her 20 years to create such profound weariness? The conversation gradually grew more personal, touching on dreams, regrets, and hopes for the future. Esperanza revealed a sharp intelligence and surprising education, quoting literature and demonstrating knowledge of subjects far beyond what he'd expect from a frontier woman. "You've read Shakespeare?" he asked after she referenced Hamlet. "Among others. My father believed education was important, even for daughters. He said knowledge was the one thing no one could steal from you. Smart man? What happened to him?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Esperanza stared into the fire, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "He died defending something he believed in. Whether he was right or wrong, I'll never know." The vague answer raised more questions than it answered, but Thaddeus sensed she'd shared as much as she was willing to reveal. Everyone had secrets, painful memories they preferred to keep buried. He had plenty of his own. As the fire burned lower, Esperanza rose and moved to the window again. Her posture was tense, alert, as if she'd heard something outside that concerned her. "What is it?" "Nothing specific. Just a feeling that we're not alone anymore." Thaddeus joined her at the window, scanning the moonlit forest for any sign of movement. Snow-covered pine trees stretched endlessly in all directions, their branches bent under the weight of fresh powder. Nothing appeared out of place, but his scout instincts told him to trust her concern. Could be wolves. They hunt in packs during winter, especially when game is scarce. Perhaps. But her tone suggested she had other possibilities in mind. They stood together at the window, shoulders nearly touching as they watched the silent wilderness. The proximity sent unexpected warmth through Thaddeus, awareness of her as a desirable woman rather than simply an injured stranger he was helping. Esperanza seemed to sense the shift in his feelings. She turned slightly, bringing her face closer to his, and he found himself looking down into those remarkable green eyes. The firelight cast golden highlights in her dark hair, and her lips were slightly parted as if in invitation. For a moment that felt like eternity, they remained frozen in that position, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Esperanza stepped back, breaking the spell, though her eyes never left his face. "I should let you get some rest. You've done so much for me already." But instead of moving toward the bunk, she remained standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The simple contact sent electricity through his entire body, awakening desires he'd thought permanently buried with Sarah. "Esperanza," he said quietly, unsure what he intended to say next. She looked up at him with an expression that combined vulnerability with something that might have been determination. "Yes?" The single word held infinite possibilities, and Thaddeus found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected to face. Sarah had been dead for 3 years, and he'd convinced himself that part of his life was over. But standing here with this beautiful, mysterious woman, he felt more alive than he had since losing his wife. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying secrets of its own through the frozen wilderness. Inside the small cabin, two people discovered that sometimes fate brings exactly what we need, even when we don't know we're looking for it. The third morning brought crystalline blue skies and bitter cold that made the cabin's interior feel like a sanctuary. Thaddeus woke to find Esperanza already dressed and standing by the door, her hand resting on the wooden latch as if she'd been contemplating leaving. "The storm has passed," she said without turning around. "The trail down the mountain should be passable by afternoon." Something in her voice carried a finality that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. After 3 days together, the thought of her departure felt like losing something precious he'd only just discovered. "You're not strong enough for that journey yet. Another few days of rest would be wise." Now she did turn, and he saw conflict warring in those green eyes that had become so familiar. Staying longer wouldn't be proper. People might talk if they knew a woman spent so much time alone with a bachelor in his mountain cabin. Her concern for propriety seemed oddly formal coming from someone who'd supposedly been traveling unaccompanied with a wagon train. Most frontier women possessed practical attitudes about survival that superseded social conventions. What people? The nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, and they wouldn't care about anything except whether you made it through the winter alive. Esperanza moved away from the door but remained standing, her posture tense with some internal struggle he couldn't understand. "You don't know what you're saying, Thaddeus. You don't know what kind of woman I really am." The haunted quality in her voice stirred his protective instincts. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever shame or guilt she believed defined her, he found himself wanting to shoulder that burden with her. "I know you're brave enough to survive a bandit attack. I know you're intelligent and resourceful. I know you've shown me more kindness in 3 days than I've experienced in 3 years." He stepped closer, drawn by the pain he saw in her expression. What else could possibly matter? She laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You're a good man, Thaddeus Kane. Too good for someone like me." Before he could respond, she moved to the window and pointed toward a distant ridge barely visible through the pine trees. "Do you see that smoke rising beyond the far mountain?" Thaddeus joined her and squinted in the direction she indicated. A thin column of gray smoke did indeed rise from somewhere beyond the ridge, too distant to determine its source. Could be a campfire, hunters or trappers most likely. Or it could be the men who killed my wagon train making camp while they decide whether to come looking for me. The possibility sent ice through his veins. If the bandits suspected she'd survived and were actively hunting her, this remote cabin would become a trap rather than a refuge. Why would they bother? If they left you for dead, wouldn't they assume the job was finished? Esperanza's reflection in the window showed an expression he'd never seen before. Something hard and calculating that transformed her delicate features into those of a stranger. "Because I saw their faces when they thought I was unconscious. Because I know who they are and where they're based. Because leaving me alive was the biggest mistake they ever made." The revelation shifted everything. If she could identify the killers, she represented justice for the innocent victims. But she also represented danger that could reach even this isolated sanctuary. "Then we need to get you to the territorial marshal in Helena. Your testimony could put these men away permanently." She turned from the window, and he saw tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You still don't understand. There won't be any testimony. There won't be any trial." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not the helpless victim you think I am, Thaddeus. I'm something much more dangerous than that." Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Multiple riders moving fast, their hoofbeats muffled by snow, but still audible to anyone listening carefully. Esperanza's entire demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerable woman disappeared, replaced by someone alert and deadly focused. She moved to where he'd hung his gun belt on a wall peg and strapped it around her waist with movements that spoke of long familiarity with weapons. "How many?" she asked, checking the loads in his Colt revolver with professional efficiency. Thaddeus grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window. Through the trees, he could make out at least 4 riders approaching along the narrow trail that led to his shelter. They moved with purpose, clearly knowing their destination. 4 that I can see, maybe more behind them. There will be 6 total. That's how many survived our last encounter." The casual way she said, "our last encounter," made his blood run cold. Everything she'd told him had been a lie. The helpless victim, the bandit attack, her miraculous discovery of his hidden refuge, none of it was true. "Who are you?" he demanded, raising the rifle to cover her as understanding dawned. "What have you brought to my home?" Esperanza met his gaze without flinching, the Colt steady in her hand but pointed at the floor rather than at him. "My name really is Esperanza Morales, but I wasn't a passenger on that wagon train. I was hunting the men who attacked it, and they were hunting me right back." "Hunting them for what?" "Because 3 months ago, they murdered my father and stole something that belonged to my family, something worth killing for." The riders were close enough now that he could hear individual voices, rough men calling to each other as they surrounded the cabin. Professional killers who tracked their quarry to what they thought was a perfect trap. "You used me," Thaddeus said, the betrayal cutting deeper than he'd expected. "You knew they'd follow you here. You turned my home into a battleground." Pain flashed across Esperanza's features, the first genuine emotion he'd seen since her mask had slipped. "I never meant for it to happen this way. When I found this place, I thought I could rest for one night and then disappear before dawn. But then you arrived, and I was too weak from blood loss to travel." She gestured toward her torn dress, and he noticed for the first time that the stains were indeed blood, though not as much as her story would have required. "I tried to leave this morning, but they're already too close." Outside, the voices grew louder as the men deployed around the cabin. They'd clearly done this before, surrounding buildings and eliminating everyone inside. "What do they want from you?" "Information about where my father hid a cache of gold and silver coins worth more than most men see in a lifetime. Confederate treasury money that went missing during the final days of the war." The pieces finally clicked into place. Her refined education, her knowledge of literature and culture, her obvious comfort with weapons, she came from money, from a family important enough to be trusted with Confederate secrets. "And you know where it's hidden?" "I'm the only person left alive who does." A voice called out from the forest, harsh and demanding. "Esperanza Morales, we know you're in there, girl. Come out peaceful-like and we'll make it quick for both of you." She moved to the window beside him, peering through a gap in the crude shutters. The big man with the gray beard is Jake Morrison, their leader. The thin one beside him is his brother Frank. They're wanted for robbery and murder in 3 territories. "How do you know so much about them?" "Because I've been tracking them for 3 months, learning their habits, waiting for the right moment to strike." Her voice hardened. "They made one mistake when they killed my father. They left me alive." Another shout from outside, closer now. "You got 1 minute to decide, girl. Then we start shooting, and whoever's helping you dies alongside you." Thaddeus found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He could surrender Esperanza to save himself, or he could stand with her against overwhelming odds. Everything logical said to choose survival over a woman who'd lied to him from their first meeting. But as he looked into her green eyes, he saw something that changed everything. Behind the deception and manipulation, behind the careful planning and ruthless determination, he glimpsed the frightened young woman who'd lost everything and been forced to become something harder than her nature intended. "What's the plan?" he asked, lowering his rifle. Relief flooded her features, followed immediately by grim determination. "They expect us to be trapped and helpless. We're going to prove them wrong." She moved to his supply shelves and began gathering specific items: rope, a small hatchet, ammunition, and a bottle of whiskey. "There's a loose board in the back wall that leads to a crawl space under the cabin. My father taught me that every building should have a secret way out." Thaddeus stared at her. "How could you possibly know about that?" "I built this place myself, and I never told anyone about the escape route." "Because you didn't build it alone. Your wife Sarah helped, and she mentioned it in letters to her sister in Kansas City. Letters that my father's business associates read when they were investigating potential safe houses along this route. The revelation that his private sanctuary had been mapped and studied by strangers felt like a violation of everything sacred. But there was no time for anger now, only survival. "Time's up, girl." Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing. "Hope you made peace with your maker." The first shot shattered the front window, followed immediately by a barrage of gunfire that splintered the wooden door and walls. Thaddeus and Esperanza dropped to the floor as bullets whined overhead, seeking flesh and finding only empty air and solid logs. "Now," Esperanza hissed. They crawled toward the back wall as the assault continued, the cabin filling with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. She found the concealed board and pried it loose, revealing a narrow opening that led beneath the structure. "You first," Thaddeus said. "Together, or neither of us makes it." They squeezed through the opening into the cramped space beneath the cabin's floor joists. The earth was frozen hard, and their breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Above them, boots crashed against the front door as the bandits prepared to storm inside. Esperanza led the way through the darkness, moving with the confidence of someone who'd studied detailed descriptions of this exact route. They emerged behind a fallen tree 50 yards from the cabin, concealed by snow-covered branches and shadows. The 6 men had positioned themselves around the building exactly as she'd predicted. Morrison and his brother guarded the front while the others covered potential escape routes. But they'd focused on the obvious exits, never considering the possibility of a hidden passage. "Your move," Thaddeus whispered. Esperanza's smile was predatory, all traces of vulnerability gone. "Watch and learn." She poured whiskey over a strip of cloth torn from her dress, then tied it around the hatchet blade. A match from Thaddeus's supplies ignited the makeshift torch, and suddenly she possessed a weapon that could spread panic faster than bullets. "When I throw this at the cabin, they'll think we're trying to burn them out from inside. In the confusion, we circle around and take them from behind. That's your plan? Set fire to my home? Better a burned cabin than 2 dead bodies. Besides, you can rebuild walls. You can't rebuild your life." Before he could protest further, she hurled the blazing hatchet toward the cabin's roof. It struck the wooden shingles and immediately began spreading flames across the dry timber. The effect was instantaneous. Morrison's men began shouting and pointing at the fire, convinced their quarry was attempting to burn them all alive. In their panic, they abandoned their positions and rushed toward the building. Now, Esperanza moved like a ghost through the forest, circling wide to approach the distracted bandits from their blind side. Thaddeus followed, marveling at her fluid grace and tactical instincts. This was no desperate survivor improvising a plan. This was a trained killer executing a carefully conceived strategy. They reached a position behind Morrison and his brother just as the cabin's roof began collapsing in showers of sparks and burning debris. The bandit leader was shouting orders, trying to reorganize his confused men. "Drop your weapons," Esperanza called out, both revolvers trained on Morrison's back. The big man spun around, his face registering shock at finding his prey behind him instead of trapped inside the burning building. "Well, I'll be damned. The little wildcat's got some teeth after all." "More than you know, Jake Morrison. Tell your men to throw down their guns, or you'll be joining my father sooner than you planned." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he calculated odds and distances. His men were scattered and confused, their attention divided between the fire and this unexpected reversal of fortune. "You think you got us beat, girl? There's 6 of us and only 2 of you. There's 1 of you who knows where my father's gold is hidden, and 5 who are just hired muscle. Guess which one I need alive?" The threat was clear, and Morrison's men began exchanging nervous glances. They'd signed on for easy money, not a fight against opponents who'd outmaneuvered them at every turn. "Here's what's going to happen," Esperanza continued, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You're going to tell me exactly where you hid my father's body. Then you're going to return every coin you stole from his cache. After that, you're going to ride out of this territory and never come back." Morrison laughed, but the sound held more bluster than confidence. "And if we don't? Then I'll kill you all, one by one, until someone decides to cooperate." The casual way she delivered the death threat sent chills through Thaddeus. This wasn't the vulnerable woman he'd comforted for 3 days. This was someone who'd been forged by loss and betrayal into an instrument of vengeance. "You're bluffing, girl. You ain't got the stomach for cold-blooded killing." Esperanza's response was to put a bullet through Frank Morrison's shoulder, dropping him screaming into the snow. The shot echoed across the mountains, final and uncompromising. "Anyone else think I'm bluffing?" The remaining men began backing away, their weapons lowering as they reassessed their situation. What had seemed like a simple manhunt had become a nightmare from which they might not escape alive. "You crazy bitch!" Morrison snarled. "That's my brother. That's a warning shot. The next one goes between his eyes unless you start talking." Thaddeus watched this transformation with growing unease. He'd committed himself to helping her, but this ruthless killer bore no resemblance to the woman who'd shared his meals and listened to his stories about. "Sarah." Morrison stared at his wounded brother writhing in the bloody snow, then at the implacable young woman who held all their lives in her hands. "All right," he said finally. "All right, damn you. We buried your father on a ridge 5 miles north of Bozeman. There's a lightning-struck pine marking the spot. And the gold? Hidden in a cave system 20 miles east of there. I'll draw you a map." "No maps. You're going to take me there personally." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Like hell I am." Esperanza shifted her aim to his chest. "Then you can join him in whatever hell you both earned." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 armed men facing a young woman who'd already proven she was deadlier than any of them had imagined. The burning cabin cast dancing shadows across the snow, turning the forest clearing into something from a fever dream. Finally, Morrison nodded slowly. "You win, girl. But this ain't over. Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Esperanza said quietly. "It's been over since the moment you killed my father." As the bandits gathered their wounded and prepared to ride out under her watchful guns, Thaddeus felt his world shifting beneath him like unstable ground. The woman he'd begun to care for, perhaps even love, was someone entirely different from what he'd believed. But as he watched her coordinating the surrender with military precision, he realized something that shook him to his core. Despite the deception, despite the manipulation and lies, he still felt drawn to her with an intensity that defied logic or self-preservation. Esperanza Morales had destroyed his peaceful existence and burned his sanctuary to the ground. She'd brought violence and death to his doorstep, then revealed herself to be someone far more dangerous than the men who'd hunted her. And yet, as she turned those remarkable green eyes toward him with an expression that mixed triumph with uncertain hope, Thaddeus Kane discovered that some bonds transcend truth and logic, reaching into deeper places where the heart makes decisions the mind can never fully understand. The real question now was whether either of them would survive long enough to explore what those bonds might become. The journey to recover her father's remains took 2 days through treacherous mountain passes, still choked with fresh snow. Morrison led them reluctantly, his wounded brother tied to his saddle and growing weaker with each mile. The other bandits followed in sullen silence, their weapons confiscated and their horses tethered to prevent escape attempts. Esperanza rode beside Thaddeus, maintaining constant vigilance while seemingly lost in memories he couldn't share. Occasionally she would glance toward him with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, but she spoke little during the long hours in the saddle. On the second afternoon, they reached the lightning-struck pine Morrison had described. The massive tree stood like a blackened sentinel against the gray sky, its twisted trunk split down the middle by some ancient storm. At its base, a mound of stones marked a grave dug in frozen earth. Esperanza dismounted slowly, her face pale with emotion she'd kept carefully controlled for months. She approached the grave with reverence that transformed her from deadly hunter back into grieving daughter. "Hello, Papa," she whispered, kneeling beside the stones. I told you I'd find them. Thaddeus watched from a respectful distance as she spoke quietly to her father's spirit, updating him on her quest for justice and the price she'd paid to achieve it. The intimacy of the moment reminded him of his own visits to Sarah's grave, when words poured out that could never be shared with the living. After several minutes, she rose and turned to face Morrison with renewed determination. Now the gold. The cave system lay another day's ride deeper into the wilderness, hidden within a maze of stone formations that would be impossible to find without a guide. Morrison led them through narrow passages between towering rock walls, his familiarity with the root proof of long use as an outlaw hideout. The main cavern opened into a cathedral-sized space illuminated by shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the stone ceiling. Against the far wall, metal strongboxes gleamed dully in the dim light, stacked like building blocks and secured with heavy padlocks. "Confederate treasury gold," Morrison said bitterly. "Your father was supposed to move it to Mexico before the war ended. Instead, he kept it for himself." Esperanza's voice carried ice that could freeze blood. "My father was protecting it from scavengers like you. He died rather than reveal its location, and got himself killed for his principles. Real smart." Before Morrison could react, Esperanza's fist connected with his jaw, dropping him to the cave floor. Her eyes blazed with fury that had been building for 3 months. "My father was worth 10 of you, Jake Morrison. He built schools and hospitals with money you would have spent on whiskey and whores." She forced him to open each strongbox, revealing stacks of gold coins that represented a fortune beyond most people's wildest dreams. Confederate currency might be worthless, but gold maintained its value regardless of which government had minted it. "This belongs to people who lost everything in the war," she said, running her fingers through the gleaming coins. "Families who need medical care, children who deserve education, communities trying to rebuild." Morrison spat blood from his split lip. "Pretty words, girl. But gold has a way of changing people's intentions. Not mine." She began the methodical process of cataloging each strongbox, creating an inventory that would ensure every coin reached its intended destination. Thaddeus helped her count and record, marveling at the sheer scope of wealth they'd recovered. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered alcove near the cave entrance. The bandits remained bound and under constant guard, while Esperanza finally allowed herself to relax for the first time since their journey began. "What happens now?" Thaddeus asked as they shared a simple meal beside their campfire. "I take this gold to the territorial governor in Helena. He'll see that it reaches the charitable organizations my father intended to support." She paused, staring into the flickering flames. "After that, I suppose I'll find somewhere to start over." "And Morrison's gang? They'll stand trial for murder and robbery. The evidence is overwhelming." Something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with that outcome, but legal justice would have to suffice where personal vengeance could not. They talked quietly as the fire burned lower, sharing stories about their respective losses and the paths that had brought them together. Esperanza revealed more about her privileged upbringing, her father's involvement with Confederate financial networks, and her own education in languages, literature, and unfortunately, the skills needed for survival in a hostile world. "I never wanted to become this person," she admitted as midnight approached. "Before my father's death, my biggest worry was choosing which dress to wear to social functions. But you survived. You adapted. You succeeded. At what cost? I've become someone I don't recognize, someone capable of violence and deception that would horrify the woman I used to be." Thaddeus studied her profile in the firelight, seeing both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. Maybe that woman was never real. Maybe Christ has just revealed who you truly are underneath all the social expectations. She turned to meet his gaze, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "And who do you think I truly am? Someone brave enough to risk everything for justice. Someone loyal enough to hunt her father's killers across 3 territories. Someone compassionate enough to ensure that stolen wealth reaches people who need it rather than keeping it for herself. You make me sound almost noble. You are noble. The methods might be questionable, but the motives are pure. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in private thoughts about futures that remained uncertain. Finally, Esperanza spoke again. I lied to you about almost everything when we first met. I know. I used your feelings against you, manipulated your natural kindness for my own purposes. I know that too. Then why are you still here? Why didn't you walk away when you learned the truth? Thaddeus considered the question carefully before answering. Because despite all the lies and manipulation, I saw something genuine in you. Something worth fighting for. What if that something isn't real either? What if I'm exactly as cold and calculating as I appear to be? He reached across the space between them and gently touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of skin that belied her claims of emotional emptiness. Then I'm willing to take that risk. Esperanza leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as if savoring a sensation she'd almost forgotten how to feel. You don't know what you're saying, Thaddeus. I'm not the kind of woman who settles down and builds a peaceful life. I'm not Sarah. I'm not asking you to be Sarah. I'm asking you to be yourself, whatever that means. She opened her eyes and looked at him with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. What if myself is someone dangerous? Someone who might bring more violence into your life? Then we'll face it together. The simple declaration hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Everything logical said they were too different, had endured too many deceptions, faced too many obstacles to build anything lasting together. But as Esperanza moved closer to him beside the dying fire, as her hand found his and intertwined their fingers with surprising tenderness, Thaddeus realized that logic had very little to do with the emotions coursing through him. I've never met anyone like you, she whispered. Good or bad, I haven't decided yet. Her smile held both warmth and mischief, reminding him of the woman who'd cooked his meals and listened to his stories about Sarah. Perhaps that version of herself hadn't been entirely fabricated after all. As the fire reduced to glowing embers and the mountain night closed around them, two people who'd found each other through deception and violence discovered that sometimes the most unexpected connections prove to be the strongest. The gold would reach its destination. The bandits would face justice. And both Thaddeus and Esperanza would eventually return to their separate lives. But first, they had this moment beside a dying fire under the vast Montana sky, when anything seemed possible and the future stretched before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told.